as we last observed, the calamitous eruption of a certain volcano circa 1500 BC precipitated the twilight of the Cretan world, a civilization extinguished in a cloud of ash and steam. Yet, as one great gear in the clockwork of history disengaged, another, with the inevitability of the tide, began to turn, but which, let us once more consult the atlas. To the northeast of Crete, one finds a rather larger landmass, a peninsula shaped with a degree of anatomical fancy, like the palm of a human hand. This is the Peloponnese, and it was upon this stage that our new civilization would make its entrance. Around this same period, a city named Mycenaean arose on the peninsula, and to a people known as the Achaeans. The civilization they forged, the very heart of this new Peloponnesian power, is known to us now as the Mycenaean. Archaeological evidence indicates, with an almost familial clarity, that the Mycenaeans and the Minoans of Crete were intimately related, to suggest that the seeds of Minoan culture found fertile new soil in Mycenae would be, to state a truth, of no great controversy. This inheritance was not merely cultural. The Mycenaeans adopted and adapted the Minoan script, developing a system we now call Linear B. Fortunately for posterity, this script was deciphered in 1952, revealing it to be the oldest known form of written language in Europe. Unfortunately for the historian, the ancient Mycenaeans were a people of few words and many deaths. Of the mere 5,000 fragments unearthed, the vast majority are little more than terse county legends. We are left then, are we not, with a rather amusing conclusion that the Mycenaeans placed monumental importance upon the fact that the lady next door was to eggs in arrears. Owing to this scarcity of written records, our portrait of Mycenaean society remains somewhat impressionistic. We can discern the bold strokes of civilization governed by kings and great generals, with armies, landowners, and slaves. They cultivated what are now considered the sacred trinity of Mediterranean agriculture: grain, olives, and grapes, one presumes, were destined for the wine press, and the olives to the oil mill. It is worth noting, however, that olive oil in this era was less a culinary staple and more a fragrance, hastening cosmetic unguent to be applied liberally to the body. They also kept vast flocks of sheep and goats, which fostered a remarkably advanced textile industry. To this, we may add a flourishing bronze smithing trade and the emergence of specialist artisans. In short, Mycenae saw the rise of a substantial class of professional craftsmen. In those blissful, uncomplicated days before the dreary invention of customs tariffs, these enterprising merchants enjoyed a life of what we might now call frictionless commerce. But prosperity, as ever, attracts unwelcome attention. Adjacent to the Peloponnese lies the much larger Balkan Peninsula, in whose northern reaches dwelt a vastly uncivilized people known as the Dorians. These fellows, disinclined to the quiet life, made a habit of pushing southwards to trouble the Mycenaeans. It should be noted that both Dorians and Achaeans were branches of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, a group also known by the more famous and frighted moniker of Aryans. Of course, if one prefers the far more dramatic account offered by the Homeric epics, those Dorians and Mycenaeans trace their lineage to a single progenitor, a certain Helen, himself a descendant of the great Titan Prometheus. The notoriously troublesome Pandora, she of the famously ill-advised curiosity, was Helene's grandmother. The very word by which the Greeks identify themselves, Helenus, derives from this mythical patriarch. Her those with a taste for such divine soap operas. The epics of Homer are an endlessly rewarding diversion. As, to defend against Dorian incursions, the Mycenaean constructed what are known as Cyclopean walls. The Cyclops of myth was a giant of formidable stature and thick height, so to wear these fortifications, some 12 meters thick. A mouse attempting to burrow through would have required a truly heroic sense of purpose. Even these colossal walls could not hold back the Dorian tide. Around 1200 BC, under relentless pressure, the delicate machinery of Mycenaean civilization began to grind to a halt. Palaces worst act, cities destroyed and, ultimately, abandoned. In fairness to the Mycenaeans, however, one must concede that their lamentable performance was not entirely their own fault. At this very moment, their attention and resources were fully divided. For in addition to fending off the Dorians, they had embarked upon a decade-long military expedition abroad, a grand and desperate gamble that had all but exhausted the kingdom's treasury and manpower. The name of this campaign is today known to all the Trojan War. That this, a perfectly reasonable question, arises: was the Trojan War not a myth? Did it truly happen? To answer this, we must return to Sir Arthur Evans, whom we met earlier. Strictly speaking, however, Evans was merely the man who acted upon an idea, the original proponent of which was conveniently deceased and thus unable to protest from his coffin. This man was a German gentleman and amateur artillery Schliemann. Born in 1822, Schliemann was, at the tender age of 7, gifted a picture book of world history by his devout father. Within its pages, he discovered a myth that would seize his imagination for a lifetime. It was the story of Helen. Her father was Zeus, king of the gods, who had seduced the queen of Sparta. From adolescence, Helen was acclaimed as the most beautiful woman in the mortal world. Upon reaching womanhood, her beauty drove all of Hellas into a frenzy. Suitors quaid in such numbers as to make the scrum for the latest Apple device seem a rather sedate affair. But whereas the Apple devotee might be anyone, the husbands for Helen's hand were exclusively kings and princes. This presented Helen's adoptive father with a delicate diplomatic problem. As he differed, it was Odysseus, of course ever the master of the elegant solution, but also happened to align perfectly with the interests of Odysseus, who stepped forward to untie the knot. Let the matter be decided by lot, he proposed, and let all suitors' firsts wear a binding oath should the chosen husband ever find himself in trouble. On Hellas would be honor bound to come to his aid. A prince of Mycenae, Menelaus, drew the lucky lot. As a younger brother, he was not in line for the throne. This presented a slight diminishment of status for the peerless Helen. At this, her ever-obliging, if somewhat unfortunate, adoptive father intervened once more, bequeathing his entire kingdom to a son-in-law with whom he shared not a drop of blood. What Menelaus did not know was that a magnificent cuckold's crown, much like the one his late father-in-law had worn, was slowly, inexorably, descending upon his own head. It happened thus. The younger prince of Troy, a certain Paris, happened to be visiting Sparta while Menelaus was away. Queen Helen played hostess. The moment they laid eyes on one another was, as the poets would have it, like lightning striking dry tinder. Helen abandoned everything and eloped with Paris back to Troy. It is said, lies with Aphrodite. The tale begins at a divine wedding with a golden apple inscribed for the fairest. This set off a bitter rivalry between Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Imagine, if you will, being asked to judge a beauty contest between your wife, your sister. Zeus, demonstrating the wisdom for which he was not particularly famous, wanted no part of it, and delegated the task to the young shepherd Paris. The three goddesses descended and presented Paris with their inducements. Hera offered power, Athena offered victory, but Aphrodite, with devastating simplicity, offered him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. The young man, bursted with all the long-term strategic thinking of a Mayfly, scarcely hesitated. And so it was that years later, Helen, seeing Paris, was utterly captivated. They eloped. When Menelaus returned, he was, understandably, apoplectic. He went at once to his brother, who, with all the false-hearted indignation of an aggrieved monarch whose family honor had been slighted, promptly invoked the oath. The heroes of Greece assembled a fleet of over 1,000 ships and set sail for Troy. To be brief, the ensuing war raged for 10 years, ending only with the famous ruse of the Trojan horse. After the fall of Troy, Menelaus, finding his twice-married wife, intended to cut her down. Yet, faced with her beauty, his hand was stayed. And he was not alone, as the Greek soldiers, maimed, scarred, and 10 years from home beheld Helen in all her splendor, a spontaneous cheer went up. To fight for another decade for such a woman, they roared, would be a price well paid. One is left to ponder the precise quality of such beauty. This, in essence, is the tale that so captivated the young Heinrich Schliemann. In 1871, having amassed a spectacular fortune, Schliemann arrived at a hill in modern-day Turkey called Hyzarelike, possessed by the unshakable conviction that this was Troy. Again, to be brief, he succeeded. Schliemann's discovery was the first key turned in a lock that had rusted shut for 3 millennia. The site contains at least 9 cities. It is now widely agreed that the 7th from the bottom was the Troy of legend. Regrettably, Schliemann, in his haste to reach a lower, more ancient layer he mistakenly believed was Helen's, summarily discarded the true Troy as so much inconvenient soil, an act of archaeological vandalism that makes modern conservationists read into their Earl Grey. Nonetheless, with Troy confirmed, a new logical deduction presented itself: the Besiegers must also have existed. Following this logic, Schliemann excavated across the Peloponnese, in a campaign of what might be affectionately termed heroic grave robbing. His efforts proved that the blind poet Homer had not been spinning near fancy. A great Mycenaean civilization had indeed existed. As this world came into focus, Schliemann realized it pointed to an even older civilization on Crete. He died before he could excavate, and it was Sir Arthur Evans who, in 1900, followed his trail and uncovered the Minoan world. Between Schliemann and Evans had pushed back the known timeline of European history by nearly 2 millennia, yet a problem remained: a great silence. And here, dear reader, you might well ask, with perfectly justified incredulity, how an entire civilization could simply forget how to write. The period from roughly 1150 BCE to 800 BC is known as the Greek Dark Ages. The art of writing was completely lost. A reasonable, if rather unpoetic, hypothesis suggests the Northern Dorians, though formidable in battle, were illiterate strongmen who acted as a sledgehammer to the delicate clockwork of Mycenaean culture. Yet civilization is like a resilient seed, it finds a way. But even the hardiest seeds must endure a long, fallow winter. Around 800 BC, the embers of the old civilizations finally flared back to life. Classical Greece had finally arrived. The dawn of this new era was marked by the appearance of the polis, or city-state. The fractured Greek landscape of mountains and bays made centralized rule impossible. The most pragmatic solution was for everyone to mind their own business. Each polis might have its own patron deity and political system, but all were slave-owning societies where citizens a right of birth governed. A typical polis had for key features an acropolis, an agora, a temple, and a gymnasium. The gymnasium, a place thick with the scent of olive oil and sweat, was a male-only domain where all activities were conducted in the nude. It is highly probable that this culture of disrobed fellowship gave rise to paideia, a formalist relationship between an adult male and an adolescent boy. Whether one views this as a noble form of mentorship or a rather problematic arrangement is a matter for our own, more nervous sensibilities. The Greeks themselves regarded it as natural and even exalted. Across the Hellenic world, two city-states rose to preeminence: Athens and Sparta, and it is with them that our story truly begins. Today, Athens is synonymous with democracy, but it did not begin that way. It was long a monarchy. Legend tells of its last king, Codrus, who learned of a prophecy that the invading Dorians would only conquer Athens if they spared his life. Upon learning this, Codrus disguised himself, charged the enemy camp, and provoked them into killing him, thus saving his city by turning himself into a sort of royal pate in the messiest way imaginable. The grateful Athenians, so the story goes, abolished the monarchy forever. A more plausible explanation lies in a balance of power. But the outcome was the same: Athens became an aristocratic republic ruled by archons. Yet the commoners grew discontented, finding they had nearly traded one king for a committee of them. By the 7th century BC, a new class of wealthy merchants began to challenge the old guard. After a failed coup, the ruling class knew reform was necessary. In 621 BC, the Archon Greco instituted a legal code so famously severe that it was said to be written not in ink, but in blood. A rather trying environment in which to live, one imagines. It satisfied no one. In 594 BC, a new Archon, Solon, took office. In this high-stakes game of political reform, Solon unshuffled the deck. He abolished debt slavery, a colossal relief to the common folk. and restructured the state based on wealth, creating new councils that broke the aristocracy's monopoly on power. He also streamlined the path to citizenship for foreign artisans, a policy that would have the immigration chancellors of any modern state weeping with envy. But reform from within is as slow. Into this landscape stepped Pisistratus, a tyrant. Here we face the paradox, this autocrat, this strongman, became the engine of democratic progress. He championed and Celanus reforms, expanded commerce, and patronized the arts, most famously commissioning the first definitive written compilation of the Homeric epics. As Aristotle himself later conceded, the tyranny of Pisistratus was like the Golden Age. After him, around 508 BC, 10 Clitians. But how does a society defend itself against its most beloved sons, the very men most likely to become tyrants? Clitians devised the solution, as it was brutal the patriciad, or os trapon. The citizens could vote to exile any individual for 10 years. Curiously, they often used this power not against men of towering prestige, believing such figures were but a short step from dictatorship. To ensure fairness in government, Clitians also decreed that members of the ruling council be chosen not by election, but by lottery. Let the fate's dice roll true. Through these successive efforts, by 508 BC, Athens had become a democracy. Just as Athens was embarking on this great project, a storm was gathering to the east. The Persian Empire, forged by Cyrus the Great, was the largest the world had ever seen. In 499 BC, the Greek cities of Ionia, on the Turkish coast, revolted against Persian rule, as sent a plea for aid. The plea reached the two great powers of Greece Athens, as Sparta of this era was a Dorian creation, a militaristic oligarchy where male citizens were soldiers from birth. Their society was a marvel of brutal efficiency, and they lead a powerful alliance of Peloponnesian states. When the Ionian plea arrived, the Spartans, ever pragmatic, considered it and refused. It was a risky venture with no obvious reward. For Athens, the calculus was different. A maritime trading power, their prosperity was tied to the Ionian cities. Moreover, Persia was a looming threat. Athens, possessing a mighty navy, felt they had a fighting chance. In 498 BC, they dispatched a fleet. The combined Greek forces launched an audacious attack on the Persian regional capital, Sardis, and burned it to the ground. But when a Persian relief force arrived, the Ionian army melted away. Disgusted with their fare, where their allies sailed for home. The revolt was crushed, but the matter was not finished. The burning of Sardis had enraged the Persian king, Darius I. He was not one to let inconvenient threats, such as the Athenians' minor role, obstruct the path of imperial vengeance. 5 years later, in 490 BC, Darius unleashed his might. Thus began the Greco-Persian War. The main Persian force came by sea, landing some 15,000 soldiers at the Bay of Marathon, a mere 40 kilometers from Athens. The Athenians marshaled their army and sent a desperate plea to Sparta. Alas, the Persians had the spectacular diplomatic misfortune during the sacred Spartan festival during which all warfare was strictly forbidden. The Athenians were on their own. For days the two armies faced each other across the plain. The Athenians on the high ground, smelling the wild thyme and sun-baked turf on the breeze, a scent of hen thrown into sharp relief by the menacing, metallic glare from the sea of Persian armor below. The silence was a thing of weight, broken only by the chirping of cicadas, utterly indifferent to the slaughter that was to come. Then came dire news: a second Persian force had taken a nearby city and was now free to stride to Athens. The Athenian commanders chose to risk everything in a single, decisive battle. Their commander, Miltiades, knowing he was outnumbered, devised a daring strategy. He deliberately reached the center of his line, reinforcing the flanks. When the Persians attacked, they surged into the weak center. The Greek center fought a desperate fighting retreat, drawing the Persians deeper into the trap. Then, the strengthened Greek ranks whirled inwards, falling upon the now disorganized Persian wings. Panic set in, the Persian line shattered, and the soldiers fled back to their ships. After a stunning victory, Miltiades dispatched a runner to bring the news to the anxious city soldier named Pihides. He is the patron saint of all who have ever pushed their bodies past the point of reason for the sake of a single, vital message. He ran the 42 kilometers to Athens, burst into the city, cried out, "Rejoice, we conquer," and then collapsed and died. His heroic sacrifices commemorated to this day in the marathon. Pihides' message electrified the city. When the second Persian fleet arrived to see the Athenian army already manning the city as defenses, their commander lost his nerve and sailed away. The Persian army limped back to Asia. Against all odds, the Athenians, fighting almost alone, had repelled the might of the Persian Empire. But would the Persians, humbled and defeated, now leave the Greeks in peace? That, of course, was never a possibility.